For this part of the course, we're going to talk about green logistics. This is a vital part of sustainable supply chain management, partly because logistics itself forms the glue, really, in supply chains as we know them today. The glue, which basically is the way that we create the flows between companies and customers throughout the supply chain, from raw materials all the way up to end customers like yourself. So the objectives of this part are really to talk about the impact of logistics on the environment, on the natural environment, which can be very significant. We will also talk about the drivers for green logistics and also the main practices which companies can employ in order to manage the impacts of transportation in particular on the environment. And I'll use a couple of examples to show how companies, particularly advanced companies, are adopting green logistics as a way to both reduce cost and reduce their environmental impacts at the same time. So this first slide here really talks about the issue that economic activity is directly linked to the impacts on the environment from transportation. As we see an increase in economic activity, we see a commensurate increase in transportation. So you can see within the graph a large increase over the last few years, particularly within Europe in this case, where we have sustained economic growth, we have sustained growth in terms of transportation. Now, the problem from a sustainability perspective is that transportation causes a number of different impacts on society and the natural environment. The typical infrastructure, for example, road transportation within Europe produces emissions of different types, pollution, which has an impact on human health, particularly for vulnerable people. We also see that in urban areas there can be disturbance related to noise, there can be disturbance related to congestion, which can have an impact on the quality of life for people living in cities, for example. And finally, of course, within any transportation, we use energy to drive the engines that we use within trucks and trains, within aircraft, and that energy is based typically on non-renewable sources such as oil. So transportation is directly linked to impacts on the environment, and therefore is something which, if we want to integrate sustainability into supply chain management, is something we have to address. So one of the key decisions that we take within supply chain management is the mode of transport that we might use, and there are a number of types, and you can see from this slide that these range from rail all the way through to pipelines to transport fluid, liquid products. But there are also a number of dimensions that companies use to decide which mode of transport they want to employ. And so typically, as we've mentioned before, a lot of supply chain activities are driven by cost. And so for the least cost option, quite often is either water transportation or rail, but sometimes the water transportation such as ships or canals are not fast enough to reach our customers or flexible enough to cope with changes in demand, for example. So we see the vast majority of logistics operations really in Europe using the road network and using trucks to transport products. Now, while we might consider cost, speed, flexibility, etc. In our decisions on mode of transport, more and more companies today are considering the environmental impact, in particular the carbon footprint related to the logistics processes and the delivery processes we have in place. So there have been a number of companies which have really taken this to heart and thought about how they could redesign their processes so that they balance these different criteria so that they can make choices which not only actually reduce cost but also potentially reduce the environmental impact and the carbon footprint of these logistics processes. So the two examples, one of which I'm going to use here is a French example, Monoprix. This is a retailer based in France. They have a large retail network in Paris. And what they've done, very interestingly, is shifted a lot of their delivery processes from the road network onto rail and onto the waterways in particular. Now, they receive a lot of their goods from overseas, outside of Europe, into the port of Le Havre. And instead of using the main trunk routes, road routes into Paris, they've actually diverted a lot of their logistics movement, the containers from the container ships, onto the canals and onto actually the River Seine. And so they bring in very close into Paris many of their products on the waterways. Once they get to Paris, of course, you can't rely on these waterways to get to the individual shops. So interestingly, what they've done is invest in technologies in order to reduce the impact of their truck network. And so they have invested in engines which use natural gas and not traditional diesel fuel. And this produces far fewer of the pollutants which are damaging to human health. The second example, which is very interesting, and we're coming back to Nestlé in this example, is one where we have competitors working together in order to optimize their logistics resources, again to reduce the environmental impact of logistics and transportation in particular, but also to reduce cost. So their key customer in the UK, being Tesco's, one of the biggest retailers in the UK, is very demanding. They require low-cost products, very competitively priced, flexible deliveries, which means quite often very short deliveries, rapid deliveries. So this means that trucks aren't always able to be completely filled when they make a delivery into a Tesco's warehouse because of this frequency issue. So what has happened is companies like Mars and Nestlé have come together and collaborated so that they can share some of these trucks going into the warehouses of Tesco's, and where there are gaps in the available space within a truck from Nestlé, they will be able to fill that with products from Mars, for example, to make sure that those trucks are filled as much as possible. And in the end, what this does is reduces cost, it reduces the number of trucks on the road, so reduces congestion, reduces the amount of fuel which is used to deliver those products, so the overall footprint is actually reduced. So in conclusion, we can say that transportation is a major contributor to environmental impacts on a global basis. So any supply chain activities which are looking to include sustainability as an imperative has to consider the way that transportation is organised and the kind of investments we put into transportation. But this is not only just a cost. If we can find ways of intelligently saving fuel, for example, we can save cost. And even green logistics today can become a differentiator for those customers who really care about their products and services being delivered in a sustainable way.